Well, Greta Gerwig's Narnia movie for Netflix began filming this month in London, and already there's a ton of negativity brewing around it. Set photos from the production have all but confirmed that the film is an adaptation of The Magician's Nephew, and that there's going to be a significant time jump from the setting of the original story. But that's not what most of the negativity is about. People are still mad about what is, at the time of this recording, still just a casting rumor. Meryl Streep is rumored to have been cast as the voice of Aslan the lion, and there are a lot of fans making hay about it on YouTube and Reddit and all the other usual places. But assuming the rumor is true, I happen to think it's an inspired choice, a choice that would highlight and enhance the story's religious themes in a way that C.S. Lewis, the author of the Narnia books, actually overlooked. So, yes, in a sense, I guess, one could say that Greta Gerwig is trying to fix Narnia. And in this case, Narnia might actually need fixing. Keep watching to find out why. Now, for those who don't know, The Magician's Nephew is a prequel to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and all of the other books in the Narnia series. It's the first book in the Narnia series chronologically speaking, but was the sixth book in publication order. It tells the origin story of Jadis, the White Witch, who was the villain in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and the backstory of Professor Kirk, the old man whom the Pevensey children are sent to stay with in that book. It's also the creation story of Narnia itself, in a literal sense. During the events of the book, the main child characters, Polly Plummer and Diggory Kirk, witness Aslan the Lion create the world of Narnia through song. And that's enough spoilers about the plot of the book for now. I only mention this plot point because it's the one I think led Greta Gerwig to possibly have cast Meryl Streep in the role of Aslan, and if so, the casting choice is, in my opinion, a brilliant casting choice for The Magician's Nephew. Not necessarily for the entire franchise, although I personally would not object to that either, but for this story specifically. But again, Streep as Aslan is still only a rumor at the time of this recording, so let's first talk a little bit about the one big change to the story that's already been confirmed. The book version of The Magician's Nephew is set in the year 1900. But, based on the set photos from Gerwig's production, her adaptation is apparently taking place in the 1950s. The clothing and automobile designs, along with advertising art styles and some subtle bits of architecture, all indicate that at the very least the scenes being shot here definitely happen in the 1950s. And this is a potential problem for a lot of fans, because the original setting of 1900 for The Magician's Nephew sets up The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe's setting of 1940. Diggory Kirk, the child protagonist of The Magician's Nephew, grows up to become the professor in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The Pevensey children are sent to his home in the country to escape from the Blitz, which was the continuous Nazi carpet bombing of London during World War II. The Second World War setting of that book's framing story is crucial in establishing the stakes for the Pevensey children back on Earth while they're adventuring in Narnia. Even though a lot of the tone of their Narnia adventures is whimsical, the fact of the war back home lends a constant ambiance of dread to everything they do. The Blitz was an apocalyptic event for Londoners of the day, and without it, there would seem to be no reason for the Pevensey kids to be sent away from the city. And this is where fans' concerns about the time period change in Gerwig's movie come in. The concern seems to be that if Magician's Nephew now takes place in the 1950s rather than 1900, this would advance the Pevensey children's visit to the professor's home by at least 40 years later than in the original books, which would now set The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in the 1990s in Gerwig's continuity. And There was no apocalyptic event taking place in London at that time which would narratively justify the Pevensey children being sent away, and would thus negate the entire setup of the most famous and most popular story in the Narnia series. But there's an easy workaround here, really. The age of the Professor in Lewis's version of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe isn't really clearly specified. He's perceived as an old man by the kids because they're kids, and kids perceive anyone the same age as their parents or older as old. Professor Kirk's age didn't really become close to fixed until The Magician's Nephew was published and told us that he was a child in 1900. This would put his age in 1940 somewhere in his 50s or 60s, which is kinda old, but not that old. I know when I first read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I pictured the professor as someone much older than that. And he's depicted as someone much older than that in the most recent film adaptation by Disney. I had the professor pegged as being in his 70s or 80s, and I think this was Lewis's authorial intent. Whatever the professor's actual chronological age got retconned to be in later books, he always felt like a man much older than late middle age. And that's because he was written as being seen through the eyes of children who are bad at guessing adult ages. So, if we assume that Greta Gerwig wants to preserve the feel of Professor Kirk as a man in his 70s or 80s by making him actually in his 70s or 80s when the Pevensey children are sent to stay with him, and she is setting Professor Kirk's childhood encounters with Aslan and Jadis in the 1950s rather than in 1900, this would put him in his 70s or 80s right around the year 2020. And I am sure I don't have to remind any of you what seemingly apocalyptic event happened that year that led a lot of people in cities to flee the countryside to escape the crowds. And see, this is the kind of clever adaptation trick that I love about all of Greta Gerwig's work. Her adaptations of Little Women and Barbie were both brilliant, full of insightful changes to the source material that enhanced the themes of the originals for a modern audience, while violating strict technical textual fidelity. It's the main reason I was excited when Gerwig was announced as the director for at least 2 of Netflix's Narnia movies. And it's this talent Gerwig has for thoughtful changes that enhance rather than undermine the source material that gave me confidence that her possible casting of Meryl Streep as Aslan in this movie could actually make her version of the story more biblical than Lewis's original. And yes, I said more biblical, and I wasn't joking. It's well known that C.S. Lewis was a devout Christian, though he was a British Anglican, not an American evangelical, and yes, there is a big difference there. And it's also known that each of his Narnia books was a biblical story retelling. The Magician's Nephew is based heavily on the creation story in the book of Genesis. Several plot points in Lewis's book parallel events in Genesis. There's even an apple used in temptation. And Lewis is on record several times saying that Aslan is meant to literally be God/Jesus in the world of Narnia. Not an allegory, but literally the same deity as we know in our world. And this is where most of the negativity around Streep's possible casting is centered. The objection, as I understand it, is that by switching Aslan's gender from male to female, Gerwig is engaging in some kind of blasphemy or anti-Christian messaging. And these folks hold that the God of the Bible is male and that masculinity is essential to his nature. But frankly, I don't think these folks have studied their Bibles very closely. In its original Hebrew, the creation story in Genesis features a creator God with both masculine and feminine aspects. Genesis 1 verse 2, translated into English, reads, "Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters." That's from the New International Version translation. Now the phrase Spirit of God in that verse, translated from Hebrew, where the name given was Ruach Elohim. And apologies to any Hebrew speakers for my almost certain butchery of that pronunciation. Anyway, the word ruach is a feminine noun, and Elohim is a plural name for God, though we won't get into that right now. The point is that in the original text of Genesis 1 verse 2, the creative energy of God is identified as a feminine power. And this is why the potential casting of Meryl Streep as Aslan is actually an inspired choice for a film adaptation of The Magician's Nephew. In that book, Polly and Diggory and several other characters witness Aslan create Narnia by singing it into existence. They essentially watch Genesis 1 verse 2 happen in real time. And since the creative power of God in the original Hebrew is feminine, it makes sense to me that Gerwig might want to cast a female actor as Aslan in this adaptation. Doing so would highlight the original Hebrew rendering of the Bible verse that inspired Lewis's story, and it would thus provide the audience with insight into the original Bible story that Lewis never included. Since Aslan is literally the same god in Lewis's story as the one credited with creating our world, that is, since Aslan is intended to be the god of the Bible, they would therefore be beyond gender as we think of it. The God of the Bible is given both masculine and feminine characteristics many times in the scriptures. So really, there's nothing inherently blasphemous or anti-Christian about making Aslan a woman in The Magician's Nephew.
I said, what does God need with fucking pronouns?
Especially in The Magician's Nephew, because that book is based on a Bible story where God is explicitly described as feminine when creating the world. Now, like I said, even if this works great for The Magician's Nephew, where I think it makes perfect sense, that doesn't mean that Aslan being female is locked in for the rest of the franchise. Gerwig or future filmmakers in the series could easily have Aslan as a male in later stories where a more masculine aspect makes sense. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is arguably one of those stories. If Aslan is God, then Aslan can be whatever Aslan wants to be or needs to be. So that's why the casting rumors don't bother me at all as a lifelong Narnia fan. I trust Greta Gerwig as a filmmaker. She's literally never made a bad movie. And I think all the folks freaking out over the possibility of a female Aslan just need to go back and study their Bibles. But let me know what you think down in the comments. Be sure to make all the appropriate offerings to the great God algorithm, likes, shares, subscribes, etc. And until next time, remember that what's best in life is to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and engage in discourse with the women.